Perhaps it was a strange foreshadowing of a coming event, or maybe it was just my love for mischief. I hoped that if Diane loved, the event might be less tragic. Love could save us all. That was the shadowy thought flitting through my mind. As I arrived at the ranch, dancing had resumed, and Miss Barkley was looking for me. She searched my face with her eyes, silencing my last qualm of conscience. "Let's go to the patio," I suggested. "I don't want anyone to overhear us." Outside, under the starry sky, Diane looked beautiful, her skin glowing white. I sensed her trembling, and my heart sank. Perhaps my gravity presaged the worst. Vaughn had been shot in the shoulder, but it wasn't a serious injury. I went to his humble abode, and he was surprised to see me. I bandaged his wound, and he was grateful. He confided in me that he had no friends, which made me feel sorry for him. When I relayed the story to Miss Barkley, she expressed sympathy for Vaughn and said that my words may have hurt him more than the bullet. I agreed with her and told her that Foster had been wronged. I knew his record along the Rio Grande, and it wasn't fair to judge him without knowing the truth. Miss Barkley was confused and asked me what she should do. I urged her to think things through for herself and not to just rely on what her father and cousin Reuben told her. She was struggling to make sense of life out here and her father's strange behavior. Despite only seeing him twice a year since she was a little girl, she was still trying to understand him. He's a man of two faces. When I see that other side of him, the one I never knew existed, he's like a stranger to me. I want to be a good daughter and help him fight his battles, but he doesn't satisfy me. He's grown impatient and wants me to go back to Louisiana. It's all so mysterious, she confided in me. You're right, I agreed, feeling for her. It's all a mystery and trouble for you. Maybe it's best if you go home. Are you suggesting I leave my father? She asked, her tone defensive. I am, I advised. You've come at a troublesome time. You can always return later if— Never. I came to stay and I'll stay, she interrupted, her temper flaring. Miss Barkley, I began again, taking a deep breath, I should tell you something about Foster. Go on, she urged. Doesn't he seem like the furthest thing from a brutal ranger now? I asked. He was at least a gentleman, she admitted. Rangers don't let anything get in the way of their duty. He was courteous to you even after you insulted him. He respected your wishes and didn't break up the dance. This may not seem like a big deal, but Foster was actually chasing an outlaw who had shot him. Under normal circumstances, he would have searched your house like a lion tearing through its prey to find that rustler. But he didn't, she realized. No, he didn't. And I think you should know why, I said, hesitating for a moment before continuing. I believe it's because of you. Because of me? She asked, her eyes shining with emotion. Yes, because of you, I confirmed. I think he felt something for you, something that made him hesitate, something that made him see you as more than just a suspect. What are you saying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying that he might have feelings for you, I revealed, knowing that I was about to change the course of her life forever. My throat constricted, making it difficult to speak. He's fallen for you, I managed to say in a raspy voice. Love at first sight. It's a terrible thing. Hopeless, really. I saw it, I felt it. I can't explain how, but I just know. That's why he's holding back, I continued. He's on your side. He's alone in this difficult task with everyone against him. If he fails, you might be the reason. You should be kinder in your thoughts towards him and wait before you judge him further. If he survives, time will prove him to be noble instead of vile. If he doesn't, which is likely, you'll feel better for giving him the benefit of the doubt. He loved you. She stood there, momentarily blinded by my words. Then, with her hands clasped to her chest, she walked straight into the darkness of her room. Chapter 5. He asked, wiping his hands on his apron. Haven't seen you in a while? Just taking a little ride, I replied. Well, you picked a good day for it, he said, nodding at the clear blue sky. I stepped inside the restaurant and ordered breakfast. As I ate, I couldn't help but think about Miss Barkley and our conversation the night before. She had a way of getting under my skin, making me question things I had always taken for granted. After breakfast, I walked out onto the street and watched as people went about their business. The town had a certain charm to it, despite its rough edges. I couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia as I looked at the old buildings and the men lounging on the corners. As I made my way back to the ranch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had been a ranger for a long time, and I had seen my fair share of violence and bloodshed. But Miss Barkley had made me question whether there was more to life than just fighting and killing. I arrived back at the ranch just as the sun was setting. The young ladies were still nowhere to be seen, and I knew I had a long night ahead of me. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was seeing the world with fresh eyes. Maybe there was more to life than just being a ranger. Maybe there was something else out there, something worth fighting for. Morton was really eager to see you. I convinced him to not go up to Barkley's. What kind of game were you playing with Frank? Jim, I just wanted to make sure he was a trustworthy rancher before making a stock deal with him, I replied. He says you told him he wasn't a rustler and had no yellow streak. Frank can't get over those two hunches. When he sees you, he's going to swear he's no rustler, but he does have a yellow streak unless— This Texan had eyes like flint striking fire. Unless? I asked sharply. Jim took a deep breath and looked around the room before speaking again. Well, he replied in a low voice, me and Frank think you've picked the right men. It was me who sent those letters to the ranger captain in Austin. So who in hell are you? It was my turn to take a deep breath. It had taken me 6 weeks to gain the trust of this Texan who I instinctively felt had been affected by the corruption that plagued Linrock. There was no one else in the room, and I reached into the inside pocket of my buckskin vest and turned the lining out. A bright silver object in the shape of a star flashed as I put it, pocket and all, under Jim's hard gaze. He couldn't help but see it. United States Deputy Marshal. By golly, he whispered, hitting the table with his fist. Tim, you sure rang true to me, but never as a cowboy. Jim, there are a lot of us around. Heavy footsteps could be heard on the walk outside. Soon Foster's large figure appeared in the doorway. Hello, I greeted. Foster, meet Jim Dempsey. Hello, Foster replied slowly. I think I know Dempsey. Not this one, I said. He's the old Dempsey. He used to own the Hope So saloon. It was legitimate when he ran it. Maybe he'll get it back soon. I couldn't help but chuckle at my terrible pun. Foster stood next to me, his sharp gaze fixed on the man I had just introduced. Dempsey, in a split second, connected the dots and realized the connection between me and the ranger. He seemed to be on the verge of passing out, perhaps from shock, hope, or fear. Foster, do you know who's in charge of the rustlers around here? Foster didn't beat around the bush, as was typical of him. His voice was deep, calm, and collected, which seemed to soothe Dempsey. No, Dempsey replied. Does anyone know? Foster pressed on. Well, I reckon there's not a single honest person in Pecos who knows, Dempsey answered confidently. But you have your suspicions? We do. You can keep your suspicions to yourself, but what do you think about the group of regulars who hang around the saloons? They're just a bad bunch, Dempsey replied with ease. Most of them have been here for years while others come and go. Some of them work odd jobs, rustle a few cows, steal or rob to make some quick cash for gambling and drinking. They're just a bad bunch. But what about the strangers who come and go without getting acquainted? Foster prodded. Some of them could be rustlers. Bill and Bo Snecker are in town right now. Bill's a known cattle thief and Bo's no good. He's got the makings of a gunfighter. They could be rustlers, but the kid doesn't seem careful enough for this gang, Dempsey said thoughtfully. Then there's Jack Blome. He comes to town often and lives up in the hills. He always has 3 or 4 strangers with him. Blome's a fancy gunfighter. He shot a gambler here last fall and got into a fight in Sanderson recently, taking down 2 cowboys. Blome's killed a dozen Pecos men. He's a rustler too, but I don't think he's the brains behind the secret outfit, if he's even in it at all. Foster seemed pleased with Dempsey's insights. Foster and Dempsey were in a serious conversation about the strange and deadly hold on their community. Rustling cattle was one thing, but the cold-blooded murder of anyone who spoke out was too much for them to bear. Foster was determined to put an end to it, and Dempsey's renewed spirit was a sign that he wasn't alone in his thinking. Suddenly the sound of hooves interrupted them, and Foster gestured for the narrator to hide behind a curtain. They watched as Reuben Darling and a red-headed cowboy named Brick entered the store. Darling seemed surprised to see the ranger and gave him a hard look before addressing Foster. "That was the second break of yours last night," he accused. "If you come around the ranch again with that kind of talk, you'll regret it," warned Darling. It was strange that a man who had lived in the West for 10 years couldn't see something in Foster that forbade that kind of behavior. It wasn't courage that Darling showed. Brave men were rarely intolerant. Foster, with his matchless nerve and cool, unobtrusive manner, was certainly courteous and almost gentle in his speech. Darling, on the other hand, was a hot-headed Louisianian of French extraction who had never been crossed in anything. He was strong, brutal, and passionate, which made him a fool in this situation. I hated this smooth, dark-skinned Southerner, and the way Foster looked at him brought joy to me. But Foster remained silent in response to Darling's affront. "I think you used your ranger bluff just to get near Diane Barkley," sneered Darling. "If you come up there again, there'll be hell." "You're damn right there'll be hell," retorted Foster, his voice ringing high. I saw his face turn thick, dark red. Had Darling's mention of Diane Barkley been motivated by jealousy or love? It had clearly pierced into the depths of Foster, perhaps more than any other insult could have. "Diane Barkley wouldn't stoop to know a dirty blood tracker like you," said Darling hotly. He wasn't intentionally trying to rouse Foster. The man was simply rancorous. "You're a cheap bluffer, a four-flush, a damned interfering conceited ranger." Long before Darling finished his tirade, Foster's face had lost its color. The cool shade, steady eyes like ice on fire, and ruthless lips warned me, if not Darling, that Foster was not to be trifled with. "Darling, I won't take offense because you seem to be championing your beautiful cousin," replied Foster, his speech slow and biting. "Let me return the compliment. You're a fine Southerner. Why, you're nothing more than a cheap, two-faced rustler." Foster spat out the words. Darling's face contorted in anger, and he made a move for his gun, but Foster was quicker. With lightning speed, he lunged forward and knocked Darling backwards, causing him to crash into a table and chairs before landing hard against the wall. "Don't even think about it," Foster warned as Darling struggled to get back up. "Get away from your gun," Brick yelled, trying to defuse the situation. But Darling was beyond reason. His face twisted with rage, he reached for his hip, his fingers itching to draw. Without hesitation, Foster fired his gun, hitting Darling square in the arm. Darling's gun clattered to the ground as he screamed in agony. Blood spattered the tablecloths as he thrashed around in pain. Brick quickly dragged him out of the establishment, leaving the horses behind. Foster calmly sheathed his gun, seemingly unfazed by the violence that had just occurred. "Well, I guess that opens the ball," he said as he walked out of the building. Dempsey, on the other hand, seemed fascinated by the bloodstains on the tablecloths, rubbing his hands over them like a ghoul. "What did you shoot him for?" Dempsey asked, his voice shaking with fear. "He was drawing on you. Shooting the arms off men like him won't do out here." I couldn't help but agree with Dempsey. "That bull-headed fool will only attract attention to himself and his gang. He's just the man I've been waiting for. Besides, shooting him would have been murder." "Murder!" exclaimed Dempsey in disbelief. Foster just chuckled in response. "We've just had a few pleasant moments with the man who has made it healthy to keep close-mouthed in Linrock," he said with a smirk. "He's a fool and slow at that." "Should I kill him when I don't have to?" I asked, contemplating the situation. "It would have been the trick," Jim replied confidently. "I'm not considering whether he's really a rustler or not. It just won't work because these guys out here won't be afraid of you. Listen, Dempsey, if a man is going to be afraid of me at all, that trick will make him more afraid of me. I know it. It works out. When Darling cools down, he'll remember, he'll start thinking. He'll realize that I could have killed him instead of risking a shot at his arm. I bet he'll go pale next time he sees me." "That might be true, Foster. But if Darling is the man you think he is, he'll start that secret underground business. It's been pretty healthy these last 6 months. You can bet on it. If that secret work does start, you'll have more reason to suspect Darling. I won't feel very safe from now on. I heard you call him a rustler. He knows that. Why, Darling won't be able to sleep at night now. He and Barkley have always been after me." "Dempsey, what do your eyes do?" Foster asked. "Be careful. And now go see your friend Morton. Tell him this game is getting hot. Together you approach 4 or 5 men you know well and can absolutely trust. Hey, someone's coming. Meet Tim and me tonight out in the open, a quarter of a mile straight from the end of this street. You'll find a pile of stones. Meet us there tonight at 10 o'clock. For the next few days, whenever I was in town, I kept a close eye on Foster or made sure he was safe under cover. Nothing happened. Whenever he received a letter, he would announce it to the entire saloon. The men would gather around him, eagerly asking who it was from and what it said. It was during one of these announcements that Foster and I overheard something that made our blood run cold. Roberts had received a letter addressed to Jack Blome, and it was postmarked from a town called Sneckerville. Suddenly everything made sense. The Sneckers had gone into hiding because they knew that Blome was coming for them, and now it seemed that he had arrived. Foster and I exchanged a worried glance. Blome was a notorious outlaw, feared by everyone in the area. If he was in town, it meant trouble. We knew that we had to act fast, but before we could do anything, a commotion erupted outside. We rushed to the window to see what was happening. A group of men on horses had just ridden into town. They were heavily armed and wore bandanas over their faces. It was clear that they were up to no good. Foster and I quickly grabbed our guns and headed outside. We were the only lawmen in town, and it was our duty to protect the innocent. As we stepped out into the street, we were confronted by the gang of outlaws. "Get out of our way, Ranger," one of them snarled, but Foster stood his ground. "Not a chance, boys. You're not welcome here." The outlaws laughed and raised their guns. It was clear that they meant business. Foster and I exchanged a determined look and prepared for the fight of our lives. Whenever the stage arrived in town, a crowd would gather at the old man's store, bringing in a good amount of revenue. But one night, after the crowd had dispersed, 2 thugs barged into the store, beat up the old man, and robbed him. The old man didn't say anything about it, but when Foster came by, he reluctantly gave a description of his attackers and their names. Foster immediately went in search of the men and found them at Larrett's place. I happened to be there when it all went down. Foster walked up to a table where Sim Bass and a group of men were sitting. He tapped Bass on the shoulder and said, "Get up, I want you." Bass looked up, but before he could say anything, Foster grabbed him by the collar and sent him sliding, chair and all, into the bar. Bass was left lying there, wondering what hit him. Foster then turned to Miller and said, "I want you. Get up." Miller complied, and Foster kicked Bass to make sure he was still conscious. Foster searched both men in front of their comrades, took their money and weapons, and marched them out, followed by a growing crowd. Foster took the 2 men to Roberts's store, where they were identified and the stolen money was returned. Then Foster marched them down to his stone jail and locked them up. The crowd that had gathered found the whole thing highly entertaining, cracking jokes about Bass and Miller. Even after the 2 were locked up, the jokes continued, directed at Foster's jailer and guard, who looked just as disreputable as the prisoners. The seriousness of the incident was completely lost on the audience. After the crowd dispersed to resume their usual activities, their former comrades were left to experience the joys of prison life. I took the opportunity to inquire of Foster whether he trusted his hired hands. To my surprise, he responded with a twinkle in his eye, assuring me that Miller and Bass would have fled before the morning. And he was correct. The following day, as I approached the lower end of town, I witnessed the same group of onlookers, now augmented by more curious men and young boys, congregating to pay their respects to the new establishment. The jailer and guard were present, proclaiming and explaining their duties with great enthusiasm. However, like the rest of the hard-working citizens, they had dozed off, and during their slumber the prisoners had managed to create a hole and escape. Foster examined the hole and then enlisted a young boy to attempt to crawl through it. The lad got stuck in the middle and had to be rescued with considerable effort. The crowd was delighted by this spectacle. Without hesitation, Foster pushed the jailer and guard into the jail, firmly shut, bolted, and chained the iron door, and pocketed the key. He then spent the entire day inside the jail, ignoring the threats of his prisoners. As the evening approached, and having gone without a drink for much longer than usual, the prisoners began to plead with Foster, but he was deaf to their entreaties. At dusk he left the jail and instructed me to help him keep watch that night. We roamed around the outskirts of town, carrying 2 heavy double-barreled shotguns that Foster had secured from somewhere, and took up a position behind some bushes in the lot adjacent to the jail. We waited for something to happen. Foster was not above getting even with these fellows. Throughout the early part of the night, groups of 6 or more men came down the street and enjoyed their final treat at the expense of the jailer and guard. The inmates were yelling for drink instead of water, and the more they shouted, the louder the laughter of those outside grew. The last group of people departed around 10 o'clock, leaving the prisoners feeling hopeless and parched. My companion Foster and I had been thoroughly entertained by the spectacle and believed that the best part of the show was yet to come. The moon was visible, but its light was somewhat obscured by clouds, illuminating the night. We were positioned about 60 yards away from the prison and slightly above it, which gave us an excellent view of the entrance. At around 11 o'clock we heard soft footsteps coming from behind the jail, followed by two shadowy figures who soon emerged in front of us. They placed something on the ground which made a metallic sound like a crowbar. We could hear whispering, then low, coarse laughter. The rescuers, who we assumed were Miller and Bass, began to open the door. They started quietly at first, but the door was sturdy and they were not fond of exerting themselves. They began to swear and make noise. Foster whispered to me that we should wait until the door was opened and then fire both barrels when all four were in sight. We could have easily descended and apprehended the rescuers, but that was not Foster's intention. He preferred to use cunning against their craftiness. He believed it was the most effective way to gain their respect. The workers had to stop 4 times, and once they were so irritated with the prisoners' demands to delay the process to fetch a bottle that they threatened to abandon the project entirely. However, they were persuaded to stay and try again. Finally, the door gave way with enough noise to wake up people living a block away. The rescuers and rescued emerged from the jail, grunting with satisfaction and laughter. In an instant, Foster and I pulled the triggers on both barrels, the sounds coming together in a thunderous boom. The group of men in front of us broke apart like scattered mercury. 2 of them fell to the ground, while the others ran away, screaming in pain and fear. The ones who fell got up, limping and hobbling, before joining their comrades in a slow retreat. It was clear they would be feeling the pain for a long time. The next morning, over breakfast, Dick regaled me with a story about how we had turned the tables on those jokers. It seemed like the whole town knew about it already, which was surprising. Even if Foster had killed those men, the townsfolk wouldn't have turned on us so quickly. The ranger was not to be trifled with. Later I went for a ride with the girls, who were eager to know what had happened. I was suddenly a news carrier, and Miss Barkley was more than curious. She found the story of our jailbreak amusing, and Gwen laughed heartily. Diane, on the other hand, had a different question. She wanted to know about a rumor she had heard about Reuben Darling, that he had shot himself with a gun and was unable to leave his house. When she asked her father about it, he became angry and refused to answer at first. When she persisted, he finally gave her a curt response. "Yes, the damn fool got himself shot, and I'm sorry it's not worse." Diane was puzzled by her father's reaction and asked me what I thought of it. "Isn't he cheerful and kind?" Gwen said, laughing. I joined in, but I didn't want to talk about Reuben's accident. I couldn't stand the thought of Darling and the inevitable harm he would bring to his cousins. Gwen didn't make it easy for me to avoid her. She was sweet and charming, and I had been avoiding her since the dance. I didn't know if she was genuinely sorry for her outburst or if she was trying to ruin my peace. I made sure we were never alone because I didn't trust myself if she ever got too close. Despite all this, I enjoyed the ride with the girls. There was something special about being in their company. Plus, Miss Barkley's growing curiosity about Foster was entertaining. I pretended to be reluctant to talk about him, but I dropped subtle hints and stories that hinted at his bravery. I never mentioned the incident that shocked her before. I couldn't guess what was on her mind, but I knew she had a generous heart and wasn't satisfied with her father's opinion of the ranger. She was like any other girl, admiring bravery and weaving romantic tales. The town was still talking about the jail incident, and one detail that sparked curiosity was storekeeper Robert's role in informing on his attackers. Foster and I were waiting to see what would happen next. When would the town wake up to the importance of having a ranger around? Just 3 days later, Ranger Foster came to me with a story about a woman who had approached him on the street. She was a hard-working, honest woman whose husband enjoyed gambling a bit too much. Unfortunately, he had been cheated out of his money at Jack Martin's saloon. This was not an uncommon occurrence, as other wives had made similar complaints. Ranger Foster saw this as an opportunity to help the women of Linrock and asked the woman, whose name was Valamont, how much her husband had lost. She told him the amount, and he promised that if he found evidence of cheating, he would not only get the money back, but also shut down Martin's place. Ranger Foster instructed me to go to the saloon that night and get in the game. I complied and pretended to be drunk to avoid being scrutinized by the dealer. By 9 o'clock I had studied the game well, and it was clear that it was a highly crooked one. Foster arrived, and we had agreed on a sign beforehand. He was not as skilled in gambling as I was, so I was to give him a signal if I saw any cheating. However, I was in no rush to do so, as I noticed a freckle-faced cattleman in the game who had already lost a significant amount of money. He had sold some cattle that day and was on his way to Del Rio with his earnings. I didn't want him to lose any more. Foster stood behind us, and I could sense his presence. He had an effect on the others, particularly the dealer, who was honest while Foster was watching. But as soon as Foster shifted his attention to other tables, the dealer resumed his crooked ways. It was a blatant robbery, and I knew we had to act fast to help the poor, hard-working people of Linrock. As I sat at the gambling table, I couldn't help but notice the little cattleman next to me. He seemed harmless enough, but then he suddenly leaned over with fire in his eyes and gun in hand. I was ready to cause a scene, but the cattleman proved to be a sharper and more daring gambler than I had thought. It looked like there might be a shootout right then and there if Foster hadn't intervened. He yelled out and jumped towards our table, telling the cattleman to put his gun away. The cattleman didn't budge and demanded to know who Foster was. "I'm Foster. Put up your gun," he replied calmly. It turned out that Foster was a ranger, and the cattleman begrudgingly put his gun away. However, he wasn't ready to let the matter go just yet. He claimed that he had been robbed and demanded his money back. Everyone at the table sat quietly while the cattleman held his gun leveled. Foster wanted to confirm whether the game was crooked, so he questioned each player one by one. To my surprise, one of them admitted that the game wasn't straight. When Foster asked me what I thought, I didn't hold back. "Worse than a hold-up, Mr. Ranger," I said, eager to prove my point. With some deft moves, I showed everyone how the dealer was cheating. The other players from different tables gathered around us, curious and muttering. Just then, Martin walked in. He didn't look too friendly. "What's this holler?" he asked, eyeing everyone warily. When he saw the cattleman's gun still pointed at the dealer, he knew what was going on. "Martin, you know what it's for. Take your dealer and leave unless you want to see me clean out your place," Foster warned. Martin looked sullen and fierce, but he knew better than to mess with a ranger. With a grunt, he took the dealer and left the place. The crowd dispersed, and Foster backed up against the wall, ready for anything. The rancher stood up slowly, pulling out another gun, and he definitely looked serious to me. "Well, Ranger, I reckon I'll stick around and make sure you're not causing any trouble," he said. "Listen up, friend," he continued, gesturing toward me with one of his guns. "Just hand over the money you owe. We'll settle up after this little show." I reached out and collected the large sum of money in front of me, pocketing it as I stood up, prepared for whatever might happen next. "Everyone give me some space!" yelled Foster at Martin and his intimidated crew. Foster scanned the room, searching for some sort of tool. He spotted a heavy axe in the corner, grabbed it, and began swinging it around like a whip as he advanced toward the faro table. The crowd backed away, inching closer to the door. With one powerful blow, Foster destroyed the dealer's box and table, sending them crashing into the scattered chairs. Then the towering ranger proceeded to wreak further havoc. Martin's establishment was rough and basic, like 1,000 other similar places. A large room with adobe walls, a rudimentary bar made of boards, piles of kegs in one corner, a stove, and a few tables with chairs. Foster only needed one blow to destroy each item he struck. He smashed in the top of every keg, causing the dark liquid to spill out. Martin cursed, and the crowd followed suit. That was a significant loss. The small rancher, holding the men at gunpoint, backed them out of the room. Martin needed a stern warning to leave entirely. I followed them out, not wanting to miss any of the gang's actions. Right behind me came the cool, daring Texan who I admired. He had Martin figured out perfectly, as there was no sign of any resistance. Amidst the shouts and cheers of the crowd, Foster's axe struck the walls of Martin's saloon. The sound of sodden thuds and red dust pouring out of the door signaled that Foster was making headway. The old adobe bricks crumbled easily under his skilled hands. First the back wall fell, and then half of the front of the building. Foster emerged from the dust, wet with sweat, dirt covering his body, and his hair disheveled. He was a man of great stature and muscular development, exuding physical strength and energy. His somber face, with big gray eyes like open furnaces, expressed a passion equal to his strength. Only then did the wild and lawless town of Linrock truly understand the significance of this ranger. Foster threw the axe at Martin's feet. "Martin, don't you dare reopen here," he said curtly. "Don't start another place in Linrock. If you do, you'll be in jail at Austin for years." Martin, livid and scowling, slunk away with his cronies. Foster then returned the money that had been taken and divided the remaining sum with the other players. He walked away through the crowd, confident that no one would dare to attack him from behind. The little cattleman exclaimed, "Well, damn me, so that's Texas Ranger Foster, hey? Never seen him before. All Texas, that ranger." I stayed downtown, enjoying the sensation and hearing different points of view. In just 1 hour, every male resident of Linrock and almost every female had viewed the wreckage of Martin's place. The commotion was intense, as if a fire had erupted. People were speaking their minds without reservation, something they wouldn't have done in a more tranquil setting. The women, especially, were vocal, and I mentally recorded their comments. "Did he do it all alone?" "Thank goodness a man's come to Linrock." "Well done, Molly Valamont. This will bring tough times to Linrock." The women's satisfaction was a testament to the ranger's approach to law enforcement. The men, however, including Blandy, owner of the Hope So, and his ilk, as well as the bunch of idle gamblers, storekeepers, ranchers, and cowboys, were all dubious or sullen. The absence of humor was striking. Foster had exposed his hand, and as one gambler remarked, "It's a difficult hand to play." In reality, the ranger service was loathed by the easygoing Texans who preferred anything but hard, honest labor, and it was detested by the lawless. Foster's authority was now evident to all, and it had no limits. It could extend as far as he could take it. Given the current state of affairs, his power could be substantial. The efforts of native sheriffs and constables in western Texas had been a joke, an utter flop. If an upstanding member of a community decided to become a sheriff, he immediately became a target for rowdy cowboys and other vicious groups. Many towns south and west of San Antonio owed their tranquility and prosperity to the Rangers and only to them. They had killed or expelled the criminals. They interpreted the law for themselves, and only such an uncompromising, unrelenting, and inexorable approach to law enforcement that resulted in the extermination of the lawless would achieve for all of Texas what it had done for some parts. Foster was the catalyst that sparked a division within Linrock, separating the honest from the dominant dishonest. It was clear that Foster's life was in danger, as one disgruntled man growled, "What the hell are we up against? Ain't somebody gonna plug this ranger?" However, what Foster represented was much more than just his own life. He stood for the ranger service, a force that helped, saved, defended, and punished with a somber menace of death that seemed to be embodied in his cold attitude toward resistance. This idea took hold of both the black and honest hearts of Linrock, making Foster more than just an officer, but a man who loomed up as the embodiment of a powerful force. As I arrived at the ranch, Miss Barkley and Gwen eagerly recounted their encounter with Foster on the main street, describing him as grand. I proceeded to tell them the whole story in detail, confirming that everything was true. Diane asked me earnestly, "Tim, is it true just as you tell it?" I assured her that it was, recounting how Mrs. Valamont had gone to Foster with her troubles, how I had been in Martin's place when Foster entered, and how I had seen him wreck Martin's place and forbid him from starting another in Linrock. Diane acknowledged Foster's actions, whispering softly to herself, "Then he does do splendid things." It was clear that Foster's reputation as a ranger, long known to the lawless Pecos gang but previously considered a vague and distant thing, had become an actuality in Linrock. He was a ranger in the flesh whose surprising attributes included both the law and the enforcement of it. I continued walking, catching a glimpse of Colonel Barkley in the background. Before I reached the corrals, Gwen came running after me, looking flushed and excited. "Tim, my uncle wants to see you," she said. "He's in a bad mood. Please don't lose yours." She even took my hand. Gwen was like a child in every way except for her fatal habit of flirting. Her sudden statement shook me out of any further thoughts about her. Why did Barkley want to see me? He never paid me any attention. I dreaded facing him, not out of fear but because I knew I would see more and more signs of guilt in Diane's father. He was waiting for me on the porch, dressed in his usual riding attire. However, it seemed like he hadn't been out so far that day. He looked worn out, and there was a furtive shadow in his eyes. Despite Gwen's conviction, his haughty and imperious temperament seemed to be in abeyance. "Tim, what have you heard about Martin's saloon being cleaned out?" he asked. "Dick can't give me any details." I told the colonel what had happened, briefly and concisely. He chewed on his cigar before spitting it out with an unintelligible exclamation. "Martin's no worse than others," he said. "Blandy leans towards Crooked Pharaoh. I've tried to stop that anyway. If Foster can, more power to him." Barclay turned around and left me with a strange feeling of surprise and pity. He had surprised me before, but I had never felt any sympathy for him. It was possible that Barclay was indeed powerless, regardless of his position. I had known men before who had become involved in crime, yet were too manly to sanction a crookedness they could not help. Miss Barclay was standing in her doorway. I could tell she had heard everything, and she looked agitated. I knew she had been talking to her father. "Tim, he hates the ranger," she said. "That's what I'm afraid of. It'll bring trouble on us. Besides, like everybody here, he's biased. He ain't got no love for Foster, but he still says more power to him. I don't get it, and I'm stuck in the middle. Foster's latest accomplishment was something new to me and strange to Linrock. I heard a lot about it from my friends, a little from Foster himself, and I witnessed the final incident firsthand. Andy Vey was an old rustler who had fallen on hard times and spent his days hanging around places where younger, better men like him gathered. Since he was a parasite, he was often kicked out of these places. On top of that, it was common knowledge that he had rustled in the past, and most of Linrock's citizens didn't know that the men he associated with were also rustlers. One night, Vey was badly beaten in a back room of a saloon and thrown out into an empty lot where he lay all night and the next day. He probably would have died if Foster hadn't come along. The ranger found the battered rustler, took him home, tended to his wounds, nursed him back to health, and spent several days with him in his little adobe house. During this time, I saw Foster twice at our meeting spot at night. He didn't have much to say, but he was eager to hear about Jim Dempsey, Morton, Darling, Barclay, and any other news I had about them and what was happening in town. Andy Vey eventually recovered, and I was lucky enough to be at the Hope So when he showed up and addressed a group of gamblers. "Folks," he said, "I'm saying goodbye to those who used to be my friends. I'm leaving Linrock, and I'm asking some of you to pass on my farewell and a goodbye message to those who did me wrong. I'm not saying that if I had met this ranger years ago I would have turned my life around and gone straight, but I'm leaving and that's that. Maybe I would, maybe. There's a lot a man doesn't know until it's too late. I'm old now, ready for the bone pile, and it doesn't matter. But I still have a sharp mind, and I want to give a tip to the gang who wronged me, and that tip needs to make its way up to the big guns of Pecos. This Texas Star Ranger was the man who took me in. I would have died like a poisoned coyote without him, and he talked to me. He even gave me money to leave Pecos. Maybe everyone will think he helped me because he wanted me to snitch, to tell them who's who around these rustler hangouts. Well, he never asked me. Maybe he saw that I wasn't a snitch. But I don't think he would ask anyone that, no matter what. And here's my tip. Foster has his sights set on the group. That might not mean much, but I've been around him, and I know how to read men. Just as sure as God made little apples, he's either going to take them down or he's going to kill them. Chapter 6. It was odd that recounting this story had a negative effect on Diane Barclay. When I shared it with her, she initially displayed a glimmer of happiness, as any woman might at the mention of a noble deed. But then she grew pensive, almost gloomy and sad. I couldn't quite grasp the complexity of her emotions. Maybe she was comparing Foster to her father, or perhaps she was desperate to believe in Foster but couldn't. It's possible that she suddenly saw the ranger for who he truly was, to her detriment. She instructed me to take Gwen out for a ride and retreated to her room. I had a feeling Gwen had something up her sleeve when she emerged in her cowgirl outfit, eyeing me as if she was ready for battle. But she rode ahead of me for a long while before she put any of her schemes into action. The first person I encountered had an air of respect, but there was something brewing inside her. "Hey, Tim, can you tighten my cinch?" she asked as I caught up with her. I dismounted my horse and adjusted her cinch by pulling it up a notch and securing it. "My boot's unlaced too," she added, slipping her foot out of the stirrup. Her boot was very much unlaced, so I took off my gloves to lace it up. I did it with a calm demeanor, but deep down I wanted to grab her and hold her tight or do something foolish. Tim, I think Diane's in love with Foster, she said seriously with the trust she sometimes showed me. It's not surprising, it's in the air, I replied. She looked at me skeptically. It was, she responded coyly. The fickleness of women is not new to me. I didn't expect Waters to last long. Certainly not when there are nicer guys around. One in particular when he cares, she said. Her little brown hand slipped out of her glove and landed on my shoulder. Let's make up. You've been mean lately, let's make up, she said. It wasn't what she said, but the pleasant tone of her voice and her proximity that made my heart race. My face grew hot, and I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. Why should I make up with you? I asked, trying to defend myself. You're just flirting. You won't and can't be anything to me, really. Gwen leaned over me, and I couldn't look up. Let's forget about reality, she said. The future is far away. We're together now. I like you, Tim, and I need to be loved. I've never confessed that to any other man. You've been awful when we could have had so much fun, riding in the sun in the open with the wind in our faces. Walking in the moonlight at night was a romantic notion, but Tim had missed something important. He couldn't resist the sweetness and seductiveness of the girl he was with, but her naturalness and truth were just as irresistible. He trembled as he looked up at her flushed face and arch eyes. He knew he had to frighten her out of this daring mood, or he would have to yield, even though he believed she was only trifling with him. As a man, he had to be unyielding, but he felt a surge of emotion that made him shake. He grasped her tightly, hurting her, and spoke hard, passionate truth. "Girl, you're playing with fire!" he cried out hoarsely. "I love you as I'd want my sister loved. I asked you to marry me. That was proof if it was foolish. Even if you were on the level, which you're not, we could never be anything to each other, understand? There's a reason besides you being above me. I can't stand it. Stop playing with me or I'll—" He didn't finish his sentence because Gwen turned deathly white. He let go of her and stepped back, trying to choke down his emotions. "Tim," she faltered. Her voice trembled with fear, but also with womanliness and regret. I am on the level." That statement touched the real heart of the girl. "I'll play fair, Tim," I responded sternly. "I won't tease or coax you again, and if I do, I'll deserve whatever punishment I get. But don't think I'm a liar." We rode home in silence, Gwen's horse loping ahead of mine. As we approached the ranch, she slowed down so we could ride side by side. At the corrals, she asked me if I agreed with her about Diane. "Maybe you're right," I admitted. "I hope she's fallen for Foster." I regretted my words as soon as they left my mouth, knowing I couldn't outsmart women like I could men. Gwen didn't respond, simply saying goodnight before leaving. That night I told Foster about how Miss Barkley reacted to his kindness towards Vay. He couldn't hide his emotions, and I could tell he was eager for more information. I described how Diane looked, how her expressions changed with her emotions, and how she sounded when admitting her father's hatred towards Foster. I knew she was caught between two sides, and Foster's eyes showed he was hungry for any insight into her feelings. I could tell he was anxious to hear any news about her, so I did my best to satisfy his curiosity. After exhausting all my information and imagination, he accused me of being an old woman for gossip. I was taken aback by his statement and could only stare at him. His curiosity had turned into irritation and then sadness as he spoke to me. He apologized for his behavior and explained that even though they were rangers, they were still human. He revealed that two sweet and lovable girls, including Miss Barkley, had crossed their dangerous path. He hoped that by doing their duty as rangers, they could somehow do right by these innocent girls. He asked me, as his friend, to not speak of Miss Barkley again. As I walked away, the shadows and stars above me, I felt sober and sick at heart for Foster and for myself. I wondered what the end of this fateful adventure would be. I also noticed a change in Miss Barkley. She became restless and wanted to ride and see for herself what was happening in Linrock. She demanded much of my time, leaving me with little time to be near Foster until after dark. As the rustlers played their waiting game, Dempsey slowly gathered trustworthy men to form a band until they were ready to strike. Foster knew it was best to go slow until the organization was complete. I could not help but worry about the situation, but there was little use in remonstrating with Miss Barkley. She refused to obey her father, who desperately pleaded with her to go back to Louisiana for her own safety. Barkley loved his daughter, despite being an unscrupulous man. He suggested they sell their property, take their best horses, and go back to their old home to live out their lives. But she refused to leave Linrock. Miss Barkley was drawn to the free, unfettered life of the country and the thrill of riding. Even though her father forbade her from leaving the ranch, she refused to obey. When Barkley came to me, he confided that he had wanted to get rid of me before, but had changed his mind. Diane, his daughter, had always been a spoiled kid, but now she was a woman with something firing her blood. Perhaps it was the wild country that had gotten to her, but she had the bit between her teeth and would run until she was exhausted. Now the safety of Diane and Gwen, too, had fallen into my hands as the girls refused to have any of Barkley's cowboys near them. It was a challenging situation, but I knew I had to do my best to protect them. Recently, folks around here have been avoiding Reuben. I'll tell you, conditions in Pecos have been worse than they've appeared since y'all arrived at the ranch. It won't be long before trouble breaks out again. I can't stop it. The toughest gang in western Texas will fill the town. My daughter and Gwen wouldn't be safe if they were left alone to go anywhere. But with you, maybe they'll be safe. Can I count on you? Absolutely, Barkley, I replied. I'm on good terms with most folks in town. I think it's safe to say that none of the tough guys who hang out down there would make a move while I'm with the girls. But I'll be careful to avoid them, especially any strangers who might show up. And if they do start trouble, I'll pull out my gun. There won't be any talking. Good. I've got your back, Barkley said. Listen, Tim, I didn't want you here, but I always knew you were tough. A man not to be messed with. You've got a bad reputation. Diane thinks your reputation is undeserved. She'd trust you with herself no matter what. And Gwen, well, she'd like you if it weren't for the drinking. Have you been drunk a lot? Be honest with me. Not even once, I replied. Reuben must be lying. He's had it out for me ever since that day in Sanderson. Watch out for him, though. He's got a temper, and when he's drinking, he's a real devil. I've taken a lot from Darling, and I guess I can take more. Okay, Tim, Barkley said, sounding relieved. Put away the booze and cards for a while and keep an eye on the girls. When my business is sorted out, maybe I'll have an offer for you. Barkley's words gave me a lot to think about. Maybe it wasn't just the fact that a ranger was in town that was bothering Barkley. It could have been the internal conflict within the rustler gang that he was associated with. The threat of being exposed to the public could be the reason for his agitation. As I got to know Barkley better, I couldn't find any evidence of his personal wrongdoing, and I felt sorry for him. At first, he didn't like me because I wasn't the cowboy he wanted, but our recent conversation proved that he had no idea I wasn't one of them. I also noticed that he seemed to be losing his patience with Darling, and there was a hint of fear and distrust in his tone when he talked about him. It's possible that the clash between Barkley and Darling was over Diane, but I thought it was absurd. As I left the rowdy life in the saloons and gambling halls behind and spent my days under the blue sky and stars, my soul was lifted. I was happy to be done with that job. It was bad enough to have to go into those dens to arrest men, let alone live with them and almost become one of them. Diane noticed a change in me and attributed it to the fact that I wasn't drinking anymore, and she was pleased. Gwen was overjoyed, and to my dismay she broke her promise not to tempt or tease me anymore. She was irresistible, and we rode every day and almost all day long. After finishing our dinner, we headed towards the foothills, riding until the sun began to set. Our journey took us to remote ranches, waterholes, and old adobe houses that had once been the site of battles between rustlers and ranchers. We even rode to the small village of Barkley, halfway to Sanderson and all over the countryside. But Miss Barkley was not content with just any ride. She craved new places, faces, and adventures. Every time we went out, she insisted on riding through Linrock, and every time we returned, she demanded we go back that way. We visited every store, blacksmith, wagon shop, and feed and grain house she could find an excuse to visit. I had to point out all the disreputable establishments in town and all the unsavory characters we encountered. She even wanted to see the inside of the infamous Hope So, much to the establishment's confusion. I pretended not to notice her restless curiosity, but Gwen understood, and it divided her between a sweet gravity and a mischievous humor. However, she never displayed the latter in front of Diane. It seemed that we were destined to cross paths with Vaughn Foster. We spotted him working around his adobe house, then on horseback. Once we even came face to face with him in a store. He stared straight into Diane Barclay's eyes and continued on his way without acknowledging her. Her face turned red as he passed, then white once he was gone. That day she rode recklessly, almost putting her life in danger, completely oblivious to her horse's well-being. Another day we found Foster in the valley, where we discovered he had gone to the home of an ill elderly cattleman who lived alone. The final meeting that proved most significant was when we were walking our tired horses through the main street of Linrock. We stumbled upon Foster just in time to witness him in action. We were passing a corner where a group of usual slack-jawed, shirtless loafers were gathered. They were having a grand old time at the expense of a poor ruffian who had either purchased or been given a frail, emaciated little burro that was on its last legs. Clearly the burro did not want to go with its new owner, who yanked on the halter, viciously swinging the end of the rope to leave welts on the worn and scarred back of the animal. Diane Barclay, who had a deep love for horses and detested the sight of spurs or whips, could not bear to see an animal in pain. When she saw the man beating the little burro, she cried out to me, "Make that brute stop." I would have made a move to intervene, but at that moment I saw Foster emerging from around the corner. Just then the despicable character named Andrews, whom I recognized as the man beating the burro, began to unleash heavy and brutal kicks upon the animal's body. The sound of the kicks was deep, hollow, and almost like a drum beat. The burro let out a strange sound that I had never heard come from any other creature, and it collapsed with jerking legs that any horseman would recognize as a sign of grave injury. Foster saw the last swings of Andrews's heavy boot and let out a sharp yell that would have startled anyone. Unfortunately, it was too late, and the burro had already fallen. Foster knocked over several of the jeering men to get to Andrews, kicking the fellow's feet from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Then Foster picked up the end of the halter and began to swing it powerfully, delivering resounding smacks that were mixed with hoarse bellows of fury and pain. Andrews struggled to stand up, but the heavy knotted halter kept knocking him down. Foster eventually stopped, and Andrews stood up in front of him. He was acting like a madman and went for his gun, but Foster was quick to intercept it. Foster grabbed Andrews' arm, and there was a loud crack as bones broke, and Andrews screamed in agony. The gun fell into the dirt, and in a fit of rage Andrews lay beside it, broken and beaten. Foster stood there calmly, daring anyone to make a move, but no one did. He eventually walked away, leaving us all in shock. Miss Barclay didn't say anything the rest of the ride home, but she looked pale and troubled.